The thunder of hooves, the glint of sabres in the autumn sun, men riding not in retreat but towards the enemy, banners snapping in the wind, faces set with determination. This is the image immortalised in verse and on canvas, a scene of courage so pure it seems carved from legend. But behind this poetry lay the smoke of Russian guns, the scream of shrapnel, and the cries of dying men. The Crimean War was not meant to look like this. It was supposed to be a clean, decisive clash of great powers, a proving ground for the might of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire against the ambitions of Tsarist Russia. The uniforms were bright, the plumes grand, and the martial spirit high. For the officers who had studied the battles of Wellington and Napoleon, the coming campaign promised both glory and promotion. Yet the war they marched into was already of a different age. Rifled muskets cut down men at ranges unthinkable in the time of Waterloo. Shells and rockets exploded over trenches, ripping bodies apart in ways no chivalric painter would dare to show. Typhus and cholera stalked the war camps over freezing winters, and in the damp, disease-ridden hospitals of Scutari, the wounded lay in filth that killed more surely than any Russian gun. This was a conflict fought at the tipping point between two worlds. The old, draped in romantic ideals of gallantry, and the new, born in smoke, mud, and iron. It would end with lessons written in blood and reform, yet also with myths that refused to die. The generals wore plumes, the men marched in bright colours, but the war they were about to fight would bleed the glamour from every uniform. At the height of the 20th century, global conflict was defined by alliances, resources, and the decisions of just a few leaders. In many ways, history could have turned out very differently, and that's exactly the kind of scenario which you can explore in Supremacy World War III, who is today's sponsor. Supremacy World War III is a free, online, real-time strategy game that allows you to take command of an actual nation in the late 20th and 21st centuries. You'll oversee its economy, direct armies of tanks, jets, and submarines, and engage with up to 99 other real players in matches that last for weeks at a time. Just as in real history, you can forge alliances, negotiate, or plunge entire regions into war. What I find most fascinating is how the game reflects the delicate balance of power which we've often discussed on this channel. A single miscalculation, a poorly planned offensive, a neglected resource, or the wrong diplomatic choice can shift the entire course of the conflict. And unlike scripted history, here you are the one to decide whether to pursue diplomacy or domination. Supremacy World War III is available cross-platform on PC and mobile, so you can pick up your campaign wherever you are. And if you're new to the game, by using the link in the description or in the pinned comment, you'll receive an exclusive starter pack valued at $25 and including one free seasonal unit, available for the next 30 days only. The newest season, Cataclysmic Mutation, even introduces a twist on modern warfare, mutated enemies, drone motherships, and elite commanders that add fresh depth to your strategy. It's a reminder that while history followed one path, alternate futures are always worth exploring. So if you've ever wondered how different decisions might shape the outcome of global war, click the link below and try Supremacy World War III for free today. As the mid-19th century unfolded, the Ottoman Empire, long a bulwark between Europe and Asia, stood on the brink of irreversible decline. Once boasting formidable armies and masters of Mediterranean trade, by the 1850s it had become enfeebled, saddled with heavy debt, weakened by failed reforms, fragmented by rising nationalism in its Balkan and Levant provinces, and unable to compete with Europe's industrializing states. Its military, once centered on the elite Janissary Corps, lacked both discipline and funding. Its economy was eclipsed as Atlantic trade routes shifted economic focus away from Ottoman ports, and its population had barely grown compared to Russia's explosive expansion. Combined, these were the signs of an empire on the brink of death, earning the Ottoman Empire the moniker of the sick man of Europe. Despite attempts at modernization, most notably the Tanzimat reforms, which began in the 1830s, the empire lacked resources to restore credibility. It required external loans to sustain its army and navy, and true industrial capacity remained elusive. As the Ottoman grip weakened, Europe's great powers cast covetous eyes on its remaining territories. This simmering weakness culminated in the geopolitical riddle known to diplomats as the Eastern Question. If Ottoman rule collapsed, who would replace it? Russia, under Tsar Nicholas I, saw precisely that opportunity. Framing his ambitions as defense of Orthodox Christians under Ottoman sovereignty, he demanded greater influence. In Jerusalem, a dispute erupted over control of Christian holy sites. France, under Napoleon III, pressed for Catholic privileges, while Russia protected Orthodox interests. When the Sultan formally granted France greater rights in 1852, Russia responded with outrage, sending Prince Menshikov to press claims of Orthodox protection, demands which the Sultan flatly rejected. In July 1853, Russian troops crossed into the Danubian principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia, regions under Ottoman suzerainty, to enforce Orthodox protection and press the diplomatic advantage. Months of tense diplomacy followed, until the Ottoman Empire formally declared war on October 4, 1853. They issued an ultimatum, giving Russia 15 days to withdraw before launching an offensive, hoping that war would rally European support and counter domestic unrest. Shortly after the declaration, Ottoman forces on the Danube engaged Russian troops in smaller clashes, such as at Oltenitsa, but the conflict took a decisive turn at sea. On November 30th, 1853, the Russian Black Sea Fleet attacked and annihilated an Ottoman squadron anchored at Sinop, sinking frigates, corvettes, and transports with shellfire in what was widely seen in Britain and France as a massacre, with nearly 2,000 Ottoman sailors perishing. This battle was the first major military engagement following the official declaration of war, and provided an unmistakable casus belli for Western intervention. Outrage in British and French public opinion was swift. Headlines depicted the Russians' actions as barbaric, and governments braced for full-scale involvement. By early 1854, Britain and France issued an ultimatum demanding Russian withdrawal from the principalities, and when no compliance came, each declared war in March, Britain on the 27th and France on the 28th. Geostrategic anxiety was pervasive amongst British leaders. Lord Palmerston expressed the prevailing sentiment. Britain was not at war to save the Sultan, but rather to keep the Russians out of Constantinople and deny them control of the Straits, these being vital arteries to the east and Britain's jewel of India. Russia's success in the Balkans and Black Sea threatened to destabilize the post-Napoleonic balance of power and to undermine British global commerce. Meanwhile, Austria and Prussia shied away from direct military involvement, but backed the Anglo-French position. Austria placed diplomatic pressure on Russia to withdraw, eventually occupying the principalities in mid-1854, effectively shoring up the Ottoman front while preserving Austrian interests in the Danube region. In this strategic context, the Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont played a subtle but significant role. Prime Minister Cavour saw an opportunity. by dispatching around 10 to 17,000 troops to support the Allies. It would earn Piedmont's diplomatic capital at the Congress of Paris, and ally French sympathy towards Italian unification. Though small in scale, Sardinia's involvement prefigured shifting alliances that would echo through the rest of the century's geopolitical landscape. By the time the first shots were exchanged on Crimean soil, Europe's major powers had already taken sides. What had begun as a regional conflict, an empire in decline, a religious flashpoint, and the ambitions of a Tsar, had expanded into a near-continental-sized war. And though the battles to come would be fought with the flags and formations of a bygone age, the realities of war were beginning to shift. The Crimean campaign would mark the slow and painful transition from Napoleonic-era maneuvers to the early stirrings of a new, industrialized kind of warfare. Following the destruction of the Ottoman fleet at Sinop, Europe braced for war. France and Britain stepped beyond diplomacy, determined to punish Russia's unchecked aggression. By March 1854, both powers had formally declared war, and naval squadrons entered the Black Sea. The objective for the Allies was to avoid a large-scale invasion of Russia, which was seen as impractical and politically risky. Instead, they would focus their forces on Sevastopol, which was home to the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the dominant naval force in the region and linchpin of Russian power in the south. From Sevastopol, the Russians could directly threaten Ottoman territories, including the vital straits of the Bosphorus and Dardanelles. By targeting Sevastopol, the Allies could neutralize Russia's naval threat, undermine their prestige and influence in the Balkans, and bring Russia to the negotiation table, while also protecting the integrity of the Ottoman Empire. The Allies initially gathered in Ottoman territory, principally in Varna, where by summer they amassed over 60,000 troops, primarily including French and British contingents, but also thousands of Ottoman troops. Yet the bulk of the campaign was marred from the very start by disorganization. As the expedition left port, the inadequacies of planning became glaringly obvious. On September 14, 1854, the Allied fleet began the laborious landing at Kalamita Bay, Crimea, later nicknamed Calamity Bay. The French, who were better prepared, swiftly disembarked under shelter, while the British waded ashore amidst a stormy sea and torrential rain. Instead of the peaceful port they'd found, the British were expecting to land under resistance, and so they had landed their infantry first, with little issue. But as storms rolled in, they attempted to disembark both their cavalry and supplies, leading to an unorganized disaster. Struggling to wade through the choppy surf, many horses unfortunately drowned, and the kit ended up waterlogged, uniforms soaked through, and tents remained canvas shells without any bedding. On top of this, the British had arrived without a proper transport or baggage corps, leaving soldiers to rely on locally foraged carts and the support of Tartar communities. It took days to field even half the required wagons, forcing many troops to carry their own rations, ammunition, and gear for multiple days. Finally, on September 19th, once organized on shore, the Allies began their march towards Sevastopol. The French marched on the right, nearest the sea, their blue uniforms contrasting with the scarlet tunics of the British, while the fleet moved south alongside them as they advanced. They reached their first test at the Battle of the Alma. Here, the British and French infantry overcame Russian positions overlooking the river, inflicting heavy losses and forcing a retreat. This success was grounded partly in new weaponry. French Minié-style rifles and British pattern 1853 Enfield rifled muskets provided dramatically increased range and accuracy compared to the smoothbores still fielded by many Russian units. At Alma, British guards reportedly delivered sustained volleys that decimated Russian formations before they could close the distance with bayonets. But despite the victory, the Allies missed a fleeting opportunity. Instead of pressing their advantage and capturing Sevastopol immediately, they opted to outflank the city and besiege it from the south. This pause gave the Russians valuable time to improve their defences. Meanwhile, Allied commanders prioritised the capture of nearby ports. Balaclava was chosen as the British supply base, while the French occupied the larger harbour of Kamiesh, eventually creating a bustling logistics hub complete with shops, bars and storage sheds. Historians later judged British Field Marshal Lord Raglan's choice of Balaclava as a strategic misstep. It lacked adequate mooring depth and had exposed flanks, making their supply lines vulnerable. Supply woes mounted rapidly. In mid-November, a violent storm in Balaclava harbour wrecked 30 ships, many laden with winter clothing and supplies. As British medical officers later lamented, men froze or starved in flimsy tents, suffering from dysentery and cholera. That winter, disease and exposure killed more soldiers than Russian bullets. Meanwhile, communication between headquarters and the front relied on the newly installed telegraph lines, a novel form of command and control. Railways were yet to fully arrive, but by early 1855, the Allies would complete the Grand Crimean Central Railway from Balaclava toward the siege lines, transforming the logistics of a protracted siege. By October, Allied engineers were laying siege trenches and artillery emplacements south of Sevastopol, putting into motion what would become the grimmest and most prolonged phase of the war, the Siege of Sevastopol. The early stages of the campaign had already exposed recurring themes of poor planning, supply failures, rash command decisions, and a war in transition, being neither Napoleonic nor yet fully industrial. As Allied forces dug in and readied for trench warfare, it was clear the campaign would demand endurance, adaptation, and, above all, some good organisation. As the Siege of Sevastopol dragged into its second month, the quiet stalemate on the Crimean Peninsula was shattered by a sudden flare of violence on the 25th of October. The Battle of Balaclava would become one of the most famous and tragic engagements of the Crimean War, with the ill-fated Charge of the Light Brigade forever searing this day into history and popular imagination. The day began with a Russian offensive. Seeking to disrupt the Allied siege, Russian forces under General Liprandi attacked the British base at Balaclava. Their immediate goal was to capture strategic positions and threaten the vital supply line from the coast to the front. Early in the battle, Russian troops managed to overrun a series of Ottoman-held redoubts, prompting British commanders to deploy cavalry to stabilise the line. Among the cavalry units stationed nearby was the Light Brigade, commanded by Major General James Brudenell, the 7th Earl of Cardigan. A proud formation made up of light, fast-moving horsemen, armed primarily with sabres and carbines. The Light Brigade was best suited to scouting and pursuing broken enemies, not for charging directly into fortified gun lines. But a series of miscommunications would send them on precisely that mission. At the heart of the confusion was a vague order issued by Lord Raglan, the British Commander-in-Chief. Concerned that the Russians might remove captured guns from the redoubts, Raglan had an order written, quote, "Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front, follow the enemy, and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns." End quote. The order passed through his Chief of Staff, General Airy, to Lord Lucan, commander of the cavalry division, who then relayed it to Cardigan. But no one clarified which guns were being referred to. Raglan had a bird's eye view from a ridge and meant the guns on the redoubts, but Lucan and Cardigan, down in the valley, saw only the heavily fortified Russian artillery directly ahead of them. When asked for clarification, Captain Nolan, who had delivered the order, reportedly gestured vaguely towards the valley, reinforcing the mistaken belief that a frontal assault was required. And so began the infamous charge into what became known as the Valley of Death. The valley was flanked by Russian cannon on both sides, and a full battery directly to their front. As the Light Brigade thundered forwards, the soldiers faced a hail of cannon fire from all three sides. The horses fell by the score, and many men were cut down before they could reach the enemy lines. Despite this, the cavalrymen reached the Russian gun line against all odds, and engaged the gunners in brutal hand-to-hand combat, cutting many down and temporarily capturing some artillery pieces. But the cost was staggering. Without support or reinforcement, the cavalry had no means of holding their position. Russian infantry and artillery regrouped, opening fire as the survivors were forced to limp back through the very same gauntlet they had just charged. It was all over in just a few minutes. Of the over 600 men that were involved in the charge, roughly 110 were killed, over 160 wounded, and 375 horses were lost. Fewer than half of the original force returned unscathed. Among the fallen were officers and privates alike, many with backgrounds from Britain's landed gentry. The charge of the Light Brigade was a tactical disaster, but it became something far greater in the public imagination. Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem, published just weeks after the battle, immortalised the bravery and stoicism of the cavalrymen. His verses evoke a haunting image of noble sacrifice in the face of inevitable destruction. The poem was widely read and recited, shaping the British perception of war as one of gallantry and honour, even amidst blunders. His poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, reads, quote, half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldiers knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, boldly they rode and well. Into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell, rode the 600. Flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabring the gunners there, charging an enemy while all the world wondered. Plunged in the battery smoke, right through the line they broke. Cossack and Russian reeled from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon behind them, volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. They that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell. All that was left of them, left of 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made, all the world wondered. Honour the charge they made, honour the Light Brigade, noble 600. End quote. Yet for those who lived through it, the charge was a bitter and tragic memory. Sergeant William Butler, who was 29 at the time of the charge, later recounted the chaos and carnage. Quote, my blood was up, and I began to wish to get near the enemy. Shot and shell were coming in all directions. What few reached the guns, and I amongst them, cut away like madmen, and succeeded in taking and spiking them. Some sound being heard, which I took for rally, the signal to retire, we got together what few we could, but going back was worse than coming, for a regiment was drawn across our path, and guns were playing upon us. I was attacked by 2 Cossacks. I engaged one on my right, and dispatched him, at the time the other made a cut at me, which just caught my nose, chin, and bridle hand, but he never cut another, for I left him on the ground. End quote. His words reveal the complex mix of fear, duty, and determination that characterized the Light Brigade's charge. The aftermath of Balaclava exposed serious shortcomings in British military leadership and communication. Following the charge, there was a storm of recriminations. Raglan blamed Lucan, Lucan blamed Cardigan, Cardigan, who had managed to ride out of the valley unharmed, blamed everyone else. The incident became emblematic not just of British gallantry, but of a military command system paralysed by poor communication and outdated doctrine. Yet despite the disaster, the courage of the cavalrymen captured the imagination of the public. In an era when news from the front lines could now be telegraphed back to London in days, the charge of the Light Brigade became one of the first global media events of war. Illustrated newspapers, eyewitness accounts, and Tennyson's poem ensured that the fallen were remembered, not just as victims of error, but as heroes. In the broader context of the Crimean War, the Battle of Balaclava did not decisively shift the Siege of Sevastopol. Instead, it resulted in a tactical draw, with no decisive victory for either side. While the British and their allies successfully defended their supply base at Balaclava, they also lost control of key defensive positions which overlooked the port. Thus, as the Siege of Sevastopol continued through harsh winters and relentless bombardments, the memory of that October charge lingered, an echo of heroism amid the growing shadows of industrial warfare. By October 1854, the Allies had encircled the southern approaches to Sevastopol and begun digging siege trenches. But from the beginning, the siege was plagued by mismanagement, miscommunication, and misery. Their preparations were wholly inadequate from the reality of long-term operations. Balaclava, the main British supply port, was little more than a fishing village, ill-equipped to receive vast shipments of men, animals, munitions, and food. The French fared better through their access to the larger harbour at Kamiesh, but even there, chaos reigned. Supplies sat idle on beaches for days. Medical facilities were primitive, and thousands of wounded languished in squalid conditions. To give you an idea of the poor conditions, author and historian Christopher Hibbert describes Balaclava in his book, The Destruction of Lord Raglan, a Tragedy of the Crimean War. Quote, "On the quayside, the muddle was grotesque. Heaps of charcoal were piled on top of split sacks, from which flour poured out in damp lumps. Bales of clothing were used as stepping stones through the mud. Broken boxes, rotting meat, cases of ammunition, thousands of tent pegs, bits of wooden huts, were dumped together higgledy-piggledy in stores or in the streets. Men sat smoking on powder barrels. The stench was nauseating. Rats and pariah dogs scampered everywhere. Turkish soldiers, ill and starving, fell down and died in the street. The hovels of the little town, which were used as hospitals, were crowded to the doors, or rather to the pieces of mud-covered rotting canvas hung across the doorways, through which the muffled sounds of weak groans came out from the fetid darkness inside to be ignored by the passers-by, inured to pain as to squalor and death." End quote. As the Crimean winter set in, the Allied troops faced not only a determined Russian defence, but also the ravages of nature. Heavy rain turned the roads into rivers of mud, and icy winds tore through tents that were already leaking or missing cover altogether. Many soldiers lacked proper greatcoats or even boots. The road from Balaclava to the front lines became nearly impassable, cutting off essential deliveries. At its worst, fodder ran out, horses dropped dead in droves, and entire divisions went hungry. Cholera, dysentery, and typhus became rampant. For many, the grim irony was clear. The enemy in Sevastopol was not as deadly as the cold, the hunger, and the rot. Yet even amid this suffering, the siege marked a profound shift in the way that wars were fought. This was no longer the age of swift maneuvers and dashing cavalry charges. It was the dawn of static, industrial-era warfare. Soldiers dug into the earth, constructing elaborate trench networks that in some areas stretched for miles. Daily life meant routine bombardment, sniping, and cold meals in waterlogged pits. The war in Crimea was becoming a foretaste of the Western Front, 60 years before its time. Meanwhile, inside Sevastopol, Russian resistance was both brilliant and brutal. Under the command of military engineer General Eduard Totleben, the city was transformed into a modern fortress. Totleben's genius lay in his ability to adapt fortifications on the fly. Recognizing that the existing sea-facing defences were of little use, he constructed a series of massive inland bastions, chief among them being the Malakoff Redoubt and the Great Redan. These earthworks bristled with artillery and braved constant enemy bombardment. Russian gunners became adept at counter-battery fire, while Labour battalions worked nightly to repair damage and deepen their defences. Several major Allied assaults attempted to break the deadlock. On the 18th of June 1855, Anglo-French forces launched a full-scale attack, but the effort was plagued by poor coordination. The British were repulsed at the Great Redan with heavy losses, while the French, attacking the Malakoff, failed to make a significant breach. Casualties numbered in the thousands, with little to show for it. A final push came months later, on September 8th, when French forces, this time better prepared, succeeded in storming the Malakoff. The British forces once again targeted the Redan, but suffered yet another bloody repulse. Still, the loss of the Malakoff was decisive. Recognizing that Sevastopol could no longer be held, the Russian High Command ordered a withdrawal across the bay. Overnight, Russian forces set fire to their naval stores, blew up any remaining ships, and abandoned the southern half of the city. Allied forces, exhausted and depleted, entered a ruined shell of what had once been Russia's proudest naval port. The siege had lasted 11 brutal months, costing over 120,000 lives through combat, disease, and starvation. For Britain, it was a sobering campaign that exposed major flaws in military logistics, command, and infrastructure. For France, it marked both a military resurgence and a brutal reminder of the costs of war. For Russia, it was a devastating psychological blow, one that cast doubt on the might of the Tsar's army and exposed the rot within the empire's bureaucracy. Yet the fall of Sevastopol was not the end. The war would continue into 1856, spreading to new theatres and spawning new tragedies. Yet even as the smoke cleared from the shattering heights around the city, another, quieter war was being fought, far from the front lines in the fevered wards of military hospitals. This was the War of the Wounded. It was a campaign not of bullets and bayonets, but of broken bodies, infected wounds, and desperate acts of care. And at its centre stood two remarkable women who had changed the very course of modern medicine. While the guns thundered across the hills of Crimea, a very different war was being fought behind the lines. One waged not with sabres or shells, but with soap, statistics, and compassion. It was in the fetid corridors of Scutari Hospital, across the Bosphorus from Constantinople, that Florence Nightingale would become the most enduring figure of the Crimean War, an icon of reform, whose influence would long outlive the conflict itself. When Nightingale arrived at Scutari in November 1854, she was met not by order and discipline, but by squalor and despair. The hospital, housed in a converted Turkish barracks, was overflowing with casualties from the front. Men were laying packed together on filthy straw mattresses, often without clean bandages or even drinking water. Sewage contaminated the water supply, rats infested the floors, and the stench of gangrene and decay hung in the air. The mortality rate among the wounded was woefully high, at one point reaching over 40%. To Nightingale, who had trained in nursing in Germany and possessed a fierce sense of duty, this was wholly unacceptable. With the backing of Sidney Herbert, Secretary at War and a close friend, she had been dispatched to the east with a team of 38 nurses. Though many male military doctors were initially hostile to her presence, Nightingale was undeterred. She instituted rigorous hygiene protocols, scrubbing floors, boiling linens, improving ventilation, and isolating infectious patients. As these practices took hold, the mortality rate at Scutari plummeted dramatically, some sources saying to as low as 2%. But Nightingale's contributions went far beyond mopping floors. She was one of the first to use statistical data to drive medical reform. Using innovative diagrams, known today as polar area charts, she illustrated how more soldiers died from preventable diseases than from any wounds sustained in battle. Her visualization of death statistics made a compelling case to both military authorities and Parliament alike. Hygiene was not merely a matter of comfort, but of survival. In doing so, Nightingale had laid the groundwork for the professionalization of nursing in Britain. Upon her return, she helped establish the Nightingale Training School for nurses at St Thomas's Hospital in London, effectively creating the modern model of nursing practice. Moreover, her work prompted the British Army to overhaul its medical and logistical systems, with future campaigns placing far greater emphasis on field sanitation and hospital organisation. Yet to focus solely on Nightingale would be to overlook another remarkable figure who also served in Crimea, Mary Seacole. A Jamaican-born nurse and entrepreneur, Seacole travelled to the war zone under her own steam after the British War Office repeatedly rejected her applications to join the official nursing corps, possibly due to racial prejudice. Being undeterred, she financed her own trip and set up the British Hotel near Balaclava, a combination of clinic, canteen, and rest stop for wounded and weary soldiers. Unlike Nightingale, whose work took place largely in the rear hospitals, Seacole often treated patients on the front lines, riding out with supplies and tending to the wounded under fire. Soldiers nicknamed her Mother Seacole, and many regard her as every bit as heroic as Nightingale herself. However, it wouldn't be until a century later that Seacole's legacy began to receive the recognition it deserved. Today, both women are rightly remembered as pioneers in the long overlooked domain of military medicine. In a war characterized by strategic folly and political mismanagement, their acts of compassion stand as enduring testaments to human dignity amidst chaos. During their efforts, the war of course continued. The siege lines at Sevastopol dragged on, but far from the front, Nightingale and Seacole were waging a quieter revolution, one fought with clean water, hard data, and unshakable resolve. And in many ways, it was this war, rather than the one on the battlefield, that would change the British military forever. By the spring of 1856, the Crimean War had dragged on for nearly 3 years, bleeding all the major powers involved. Russia, reeling from defeat at Sevastopol and hampered by a crumbling economy, faced mounting unrest at home. The war had exposed deep weaknesses in its infrastructure, inadequate railways, outdated industry, and a sluggish bureaucracy, and there was a growing awareness within the Russian court that continuing the fight risked internal collapse. Britain and France, despite their battlefield successes, were also feeling the strain. Public opinion was turning sour as casualty lists lengthened, and the cost of war, both in money and in human life, became increasingly difficult to justify. The Ottoman Empire, though technically on the winning side, had been stretched to its limits. Its army and treasury were both dangerously depleted, and much of its military capacity had been dependent on foreign aid. Against this backdrop, diplomats met in Paris in February 1856 to negotiate a peace settlement. On the side of the Russians, Tsar Alexander II was willing to reach a compromise. He had inherited the throne after Tsar Nicholas had caught a chill and refused medical treatment, eventually dying of pneumonia in March 1855. From his perspective as the new Tsar, Alexander knew that further conflict could undo his authority before it had even taken root. The British and French governments, for their part, were eager to secure a settlement that would curb Russian expansion without overcommitting their own forces. The Treaty of Paris was signed on the 30th of March 1856 and brought the war to a formal close. Its terms were designed to prevent a repeat of the conflict and were laid down as follows. The Black Sea was declared neutral territory, closed to all warships and coastal fortifications, depriving Russia of its ability to project naval power in the region. The Danubian principalities were returned to Ottoman suzerainty, with guarantees of autonomy under the collective protection of the European powers. And the Ottoman Empire was formally admitted into the concert of Europe, granting it a nominal place in the system of great power diplomacy, though in practice this recognition was more symbolic than transformative. On paper, the treaty looked like a diplomatic triumph for Britain, France and their allies. Russia had been checked, the balance of power maintained, and the Ottomans persevered as a buffer against Russian expansion. Yet the reality was less decisive. The treaty had not resolved the underlying rivalries, it had merely frozen them. Within 2 decades, Russia would reassert itself in the Balkans, and the Black Sea clauses would be overturned entirely. For Russia, the war's end was a humiliation, but also a turning point. Alexander II embarked on a program of reforms, including the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, partly in response to the war's lessons. For Britain, the war's outcome was ambiguous. It had contained Russia, but at the cost of exposing its own military inefficiencies. France had emerged with a short-lived sense of prestige, while the Ottomans, though spared from total collapse, remained dependent on European life support. The Treaty of Paris was less a peace settlement than a pause, an uneasy truce in the long rivalry between empires. The guns had fallen silent for now, but the storm clouds over Europe had not truly been lifted. After the guns had fallen silent in 1856, the Crimean War seemed to many an isolated conflict, a sharp but contained clash of empires in a distant corner of Europe. Yet in truth, it was a war that cast a long shadow over the decades to come. The lessons it offered, and in some cases the myths it fostered, would echo all the way to the killing fields of the 20th century. While the Crimean War did spur reforms, the British Army began to overhaul its supply systems, medical services, and officer training, while Russia undertook sweeping internal changes under Alexander II. The war's deeper strategic lessons about the cost of attrition, the dangers of unclear command, and the futility of outdated tactics against modern firepower were often only partially, if at all, learned. Militarily, the Crimean War was a bridge between eras. It retained the romantic trappings of the Napoleonic age, bright uniforms, cavalry charges, and generals commanding from horseback. Yet the battlefield was increasingly shaped by industrial age realities. Rifled muskets extended killing ranges and rendered traditional frontal assaults and bayonet charges even deadlier, or perhaps suicidal. Artillery, supplied by rail and capable of sustained bombardment, had transformed sieges into prolonged slaughters. And the telegraph brought orders and news across continents in hours rather than weeks, shrinking the world of diplomacy and command. These innovations will be refined and multiplied in later conflicts. The Boer War, fought at the century's end, saw Britain once again grappling with entrenched positions, long-range rifle fire, and the logistical demands of modern campaigning. By the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, The rifle pits and artillery duels of Sevastopol seemed eerily familiar, only now magnified for a modern industrial scale. The Crimean War's mix of outdated tactics and modern killing power was a grim foretaste of the stalemates and mass casualties that would define the Western Front. Crucially, the Crimean War also introduced something new: the modern media war. For the first time, war correspondents such as William Howard Russell of the Times brought vivid and often unflattering accounts directly to the public. His reports on the mismanagement of supplies, the suffering of soldiers, and the heroism of figures like Florence Nightingale stirred outrage and reform at home. The war was also one of the first to be photographed, with Roger Fenton's carefully composed images offering Victorian audiences a curated but tangible view of the front. This marriage of reporting and imagery created a template for how conflicts would be consumed and sometimes mythologized by the public. Few episodes better illustrate that myth-making than the charge of the Light Brigade. Despite its disastrous outcome, the action was immortalised almost instantly in painting and prose. Alfred Lord Tennyson's verses turned a costly blunder into a legend of gallantry, framing the doomed cavalrymen as martyrs to duty. Such romantic portrayals became part of Britain's martial identity, shaping public perceptions of war for generations to come. This in turn had its own consequences. By the time the First World War had arrived, many young men still carried a vision of war as an honourable adventure, a vision partly inherited from the Victorian era's selective memory of conflicts like Crimea. Posters and speeches invoked the same spirit of chivalry and sacrifice that the charge of the Light Brigade had had. Yet rather than an adventure filled with romanticised heroic acts and cavalry charges, those sent to the front in 1914 were instead met by muddy trenches, constant artillery fire, and mechanised warfare that would come to define the slaughter of the First World War. In the end, the Crimean War was both a warning and a blueprint. It showed what happened when industrial progress collided with traditional warfare, and it demonstrated how public opinion, fueled by rapid communication, could shape the course and legacy of a conflict. Though often overshadowed in popular history by the cataclysms that followed in the 20th century, it was in Crimea that the modern age of war, with its technology, bureaucracy and propaganda, truly began to take form, and showing how the tactics, strategies and romance of a bygone era of warfare was coming to an end. Click the link in the description or in the pinned comment to play Supremacy World War III for free today and claim your exclusive $25 starter pack, including one powerful seasonal unit, available for the next 30 days only.